again to AIU for inviting me to share another class. I'm gonna try and clean up here real quick and get my presentation ready. But real quick, I guess before I start my presentation, I'd like to introduce myself again. It's been about a year and a half now that I've been sharing monthly classes with AIU. But my name is Tobias Roberts. I am originally from the United States, but I've been living in Central America between Guatemala and El Salvador for much of the past 20 years or so. And I was originally invited to share a number of courses related to community development or international development. I worked for about 10 years with different nonprofit organizations working with small farmers mostly, but all different size projects from small scale grassroots initiatives to large multi-country development initiatives. And then about 10 years ago, about 9 years ago now, my family and I decided that we wanted to be done working with the whole development industry. We wanted to be a little bit closer to a rural community of our own. So we left the organization we were working with at the time, and we've been working as small farmers. Here in the mountains of El Salvador, we participate in different cooperatives with our neighbors. We have a ecotourism cooperative and also a small farmers cooperative with organic vegetable and fruit production. And I think, in a sense, it's kind of offered me I guess you could say, kind of a perspective from two different sides of how development works, right? From the side of those who design projects and implement them and search for funding and write the reports and all of that. And then also from the side of the community, those who are often seen as the recipients of development projects. And so we've talked about over the last year and a half, we've shared several different ideas about how the development industry can perhaps rescue itself from a lot of the incoherencies. And today I want to share a little bit about I guess you could say, a sociological current called post-development thought. It's something that developed mostly out of different Latin American anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers who were very critical of this whole idea of mostly North American and European organizations coming into, in this case, Latin America, but also obviously in Africa, certain parts of Eastern Europe after World War II, during the Cold War, parts of Asia, China, but this whole kind of colonialist ethic of the wealthy coming to save the poor, and then this whole idea of what is developed and what is underdeveloped. And so the post-development thinkers, there are several of them that are very prominent, that continue to write, I think, very, very presciently and very, very intelligently, criticizing some of this worst aspects of what this kind of development paradigm outlines. So I want to share a little bit real quick. I always try to keep my classes to about 40 or 45 minutes so we can have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions and for you all to share your experiences, your critiques, whatever it might be. So I'm going to make my screen here large and we're going to get started. Okay, post-development thought, questioning the assumptions of the development industry. And that's something I think is important, that idea of assumptions, because I would say that the main kind of currents within our society, especially those of us who have grown up in this whole idea of progress as a completely benign and important and necessary attribute of human societies, that we need to progress, we need to grow, we need to have more. More affluence is always better. More education is always better. More access to health is always better. We say these things, and most people would never question them. We would never think to question whether this is right or wrong. No, of course, we need to defeat poverty, and the best way to defeat poverty is by introducing people to the market, to monetary economies, and having them increase their savings, their wealth, their monetary wealth. We would never question generally that allowing children in a rural community to have better access to education could be detrimental. And so there's these assumptions within development industry that more education, more health, more money, more jobs are always going to be better. But I think, and a lot of the post-development thinkers we're going to introduce you to this morning, question that. They say, hold on, let's dig a little bit deeper, right? Development for who, and what is the opposite of development? So the class outline is I want to talk, starting with the idea of the history of the development paradigm. Actually, what we're going to see is that this whole idea that there exist developed and underdeveloped countries is actually a relatively new nuance to the English language, to international politics. We're going to see before World War II that the concept of underdeveloped areas or nations was not something that was discussed. This is something that grew out of the post-World War II order. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the ethos and the tragedy, perhaps, of the progress myth, especially well, during the Cold War, and then also especially in the last 3 decades. There's kind of been this universalization of the idea of progress, that every culture, every nation, every community, every people needs to get on board with this idea of the onward march of progress, that humanity needs to grow, needs to achieve new technological feats, needs to defeat poverty in the sense of creating a global middle class where everybody is going to be kind of consumers in the light of the American middle class, the European middle class. So we're going to talk about the ethos of that, what's behind that, and then perhaps some of the tragedy. I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we're going to follow two of my favorite authors, two of the leading post-development thinkers, philosophers, Arturo Escobar, who is from Colombia, and Gustavo Esteva, who recently passed away, is from Mexico. So we're going to follow a little bit of their thought about what is this whole concept of post-development. And then at the end, I'd like to briefly look at some strategies or some ideas, some prospects from my own experience as working as in the international development agencies, about how we can rescue this idea of development. Right, I'm going to criticize, following post-development thinkers, a lot of what passes today for development projects, but I don't think that for example, development organizations, community development agencies need to necessarily disappear. I do think there need to be some major changes. So we're going to look at the difference between the idea of progress and the idea of betterment, and then the issue of wide goals, objectives, versus narrow goals and objectives. So here's a cartoon that I like. It says at the top, then and now. And so then, if you go back, starting in the post-World War II area, out of the Bretton Woods agreements, trying to create this new world order, and now that the world had defeated Nazism and fascism in Europe, and we wanted to create this new kind of shared affluence and bring everybody up to the living standards of the West. And so they were created the World Bank, the IMF, a lot of these multinational banks. And they were tasked with going to the rest of the world and saying, you need to reform. You need to change. We want to bring you up to our standards of living. We want you to live like we do. And you don't know how to do that. Your governments don't know how to do that. Your traditional community leaders, your traditional cultural paradigms, all of that is miring you in this backwardness of poverty, of stagnation, and you're missing out on all of these wonderful fruits of progress and modernity. And so the IMF and the World Bank, through obviously loans, and through a lot of times kind of colonial intermission into national politics, using a lot of times the not so benign corruption of national politicians in different countries, imposed certain economic paradigms about opening up markets, about deregulating, about signing free trade agreements, trying to push every nation, every culture, every people to follow this idea of onward march of progress, more growth, more affluence, more education. And now, if we go fast forward several decades, there are voices, especially in post-development thought and around the world, who's saying that, look, maybe we had it backwards, right? Maybe who needs to reform is not just the World Bank and the IMF, but the people who they represent, this idea of Western affluence, right? If we look at all of the ecological and social crises that we're facing today, climate change, biodiversity loss, the multiplication of toxic chemicals in every aspect of our environment, the rise of cancers, growing social inequalities, all of these things. This is kind of an obvious consequence of an economic and social paradigm based on nonstop economic growth. We've talked about this in past classes, that trying to grow indefinitely within a closed paradigm, which is the earth, the biophysical limits of the earth in which we live, has pushed us up to these vulnerabilities where today there's no shortage of ecological crises for us to face. And so now, instead of these Western nations coming in to say this is what we need to do, this is how you need to change, maybe it's time to kind of switch the tables. In the remnants of traditional cultures, those who lived sustainably in places for so many times, maybe we need to give them an opportunity to share how we need to reform, how people in the West, how those of us who have completely been engulfed by this progress narrative. But let's start about with the history. So again, a lot of us probably think that that this idea of developed versus underdeveloped is something that has existed for a long time, but actually it hasn't. The idea of underdevelopment as a policy, underdevelopment as a something that needed to be defeated, as a differentiation between different nations, really only started to take off, was only really started to be discussed after World War II. Harry Truman was the president at the end of the United States at the end of World War II. In his inaugural address, he says, this is a statement: "We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas." That was the first time that a U.S. politician, especially a president, had specifically mentioned that there were underdeveloped areas that needed what the U.S. had, specifically science and industry. More than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate. They are victims of disease. Their economic life is primitive and stagnant. Their poverty is a handicap and a threat both to them and to the more prosperous areas. So here he's starting to outline this idea that in order to issue in this new era of world peace, especially after the wars in Europe of World War II, what the strategy that was being outlined by the United States, by the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, was this idea of a global prosperity where everybody is going to live in similar conditions, and when everybody was wealthy and happy, there would be no reason for all of these wars. For the first time in history, Truman says, humanity possesses the knowledge and the skill to relieve the suffering of these people. The United States is preeminent among nations in the development of industrial and scientific techniques. The material resources which we can afford to use for the assistance of other peoples are limited, but our imponderable resources and technical knowledge are constantly growing. I believe that we should make available to peace-loving peoples the benefit of our store of technical knowledge in order to help them realize the aspirations for a better life. And so this is the first time that there was this idea that wealthy nations, the United States, and after the Marshall Plan, Europe and other pockets, then Japan and in other certain parts of the world, needed to bring every other nation up to their standards of living, and not just their standards of living, following their path towards development. You can look at the things that I've highlighted: scientific advances, industrial progress, more prosperity, knowledge and skill from the Western mindset, not knowledge and skill from traditional livelihoods. Imponderable resources of technical knowledge. And all of this is necessary if people are going to live a better life. So this idea of equating a good life, a life worth living, with more resources, more technology, more industry, more affluence. This is something that only really started in the post-World War II area. And it wasn't shortly after that that the United Nations created what they call the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And this is a bulletin of theirs from 1951. And here's what they say. They say, kind of echoing this sentiment that Truman outlined in his inaugural address. They say, "There is a sense in which rapid economic progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped. Old social institutions have to disintegrate. Bonds of caste and creed and race have to burst, and large numbers of persons who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. Very few communities are willing to pay the full price of economic progress." This is from the United Nations, right? The organization that we usually think of protecting traditional communities, but they outline it pretty well, that they were full on board with this idea that in order for progress to happen, in order for development to happen, there was a need to break traditional structures, right? Traditional ways of life, traditional economies, localized ways that indigenous communities and small farming communities and people around the world had adapted to their environments. This was seen as backwards, as archaic, as a barrier to this idea of universal global prosperity. And they said, no, we have to break this, right? They use, pretty strong words there: scrapping things, disintegrating things, yeah, breaking old ways of life. And so that's kind of where it started, right? There's this idea that, okay, we're going to change. We have to change traditional ways of life so that everybody can develop, everybody can aspire to the same things. So what is the ethos of this? A lot of the post-development thinkers, especially Arturo Escobar, talks of this as he mentions the idea that the development discourse, this idea of the progress myth, of always wanting to aspire everyone everywhere to the same thing. And they, like I said, there's some unquestioned assumptions of the development discourse. One, that poverty is an evil that must be defeated. Most people would be 100% on board with that. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. What is poverty? What constitutes poverty? How do we know if people are in poverty? Is it the same that a small farmer who has very, very limited monetary income but feeds himself from the land, he's going to be obviously considered to be poor, but a single woman living in the slums of some South American city who has a job and might make $10 a day living as a squatter in some camp, she might not fall within the limits of poverty due to her supposed income. So there's obviously a little cartoon here as well, where a little boy asks his daddy, "Daddy, are we poor?" And he says, "I don't know. Let's see how the government defines it this week." This idea that poverty is something that we need to defeat, we need to question that. What is poverty? Who defines that? Under what parameters? Other assumptions of the development discourse is that better incomes and more purchasing power within the monetary economies, increasingly within deregulated free markets dominated by a global economic system, inevitably leads to more satisfaction. That people are going to be happier the more money they have. That's another kind of assumption of the development discourse. That higher standards of living, mostly within the monetary economy, must be irrevocably pursued to improve the human condition. That the only thing that we can do to improve our lot in life is aspire for more money, to have more income. Another kind of ethos of the development paradigm is that a firm attachment to a competitive economic system focused on unrelenting growth, industrialism, technology transfer, and market primacy is the best path to achieve these goals. That there are certain ways to do things better, and the best way to do that, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was everybody jumping on the capitalist bandwagon, right? Everybody trying to follow the American dream globalized. That is the ethos. And I would say that the majority of development organizations around the world, obviously, money into development flows from the north to the south, from wealthy countries to poorer countries. And though there are all different types of development organizations, in general, there is an ethos that follows these assumptions that those who are donating money are donating to poor countries, to poor people, to poor areas of the world, so that they can raise their standard of living to try and emulate or imitate those who have made it, right? Those who are in the global north. I'm going to argue that this development paradigm, this discourse, the assumptions of that discourse are actually a tragedy. It's leading us towards, it's kind of like the Greek tragedy, right? You imagine a bunch of people sitting around watching one of Homer's plays or something, one of Homer's tragedies, and you know it's coming, right? You can see it building up. The audience knows that there's a final, an outcome to this whole thing that's not going to be good for anybody, but nobody can do anything about it. And I think that's kind of where we're at today, as we see this development paradigm start to unravel, as everybody is trying to follow this same model. I think we know that we're coming. This is a graphic here that's widely published. These are called the planetary boundaries. There's lots of organizations that follow these, but it's climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmosphere aerosol, ocean acidification, the biogeochemical flows, freshwater change, land system change, biosphere integrity. All of these are the things that we need to survive. The Earth system has to be functioning in order for humanity to survive. We depend on the Earth. We depend on the Earth for air and water and food and soil. And though many people want to have this idea or believe that we can escape, that we can have economic progress without really worrying about the world, it's false, right? And so the planetary boundaries within this little green circle here is what's known as the safe operating space. And so in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, it's fairly uh, well established that we are way past the safe operating space, right? We are using more of the Earth's resources than what it can reproduce annually. We're throwing more of our waste in form of pollution, in form of greenhouse gases, faster than the Earth can accumulate them. And we continue upon this runaway freight train of global economic development, of everybody trying to follow the same path of increasing accumulation, right? So what's this tragedy? The tragedy is that unbridled economic growth, globalized, pushing externalities onto an enormous portions of the global population, right? For everybody to want to live like a middle-class American or European citizen would require 7 to 8 Earths. We don't have 7 to 8 Earths. We have one Earth. Even though Elon Musk is talking about mining asteroids and sending us to Mars, that's a far way away. And we simply do not have enough resources. The Earth system does not have enough regenerative capacity to follow that model, yet we continue to follow it blindly. Inevitably, the development paradigm sets us on a course to hit the biophysical limits and planetary boundaries. As you can see, several of them we've already hit. And the emergence of the global middle class. By 2023, the global middle class reached about 4 billion people, with over a billion people in developing countries moving up the global middle class, up from just 250 million in 2000. By 2031, the global middle class might reach 5 billion people. And one of the interesting things is that the United States, Europe, Japan, many of these wealthy countries, for the longest time pushed this idea, right? This idea, like we showed in the quotes from Harry Truman and from the United Nations in 1951, that everyone had to achieve this astounding affluence. And recently, there's been some discourse by leading politicians in the West saying, hold on, we can't have all of these Chinese and Indian people suddenly wanting to consume the way we do. And that's a incredibly violent and colonialist rhetoric, right? Saying there's one Earth and we want it for ourselves. And in a past class, we talked about the need to degrow, the degrowth movement that is very small. But if we're going to have a world where we can share what's needed for life, then obviously the wealthy nations, the United States, Europe, need to degrow. People that need to have less, need to consume less. But within the development industry, those of us who work, we need to question this idea that everybody needs to attain a certain level of affluence. It simply is not possible. Besides the fact of oh well, we can say well the United States did it and people in Europe did it, so now people in Latin America and Africa and Asia should have that right. That might be a rights-based discourse, but if we look at a reality-based discourse, we can say well that's simply not possible. Okay, everybody trying to achieve a certain level of lifestyle within a closed biophysical system is a tragedy, right? And I was talking about different leaders around the world who are starting to change their rhetoric, and I think it's extremely violent in this kind of maintained colonial discourse that a lot of these Western thinkers are saying, okay, well now we need to change, and they're not asking necessarily for their own citizens to change. To say, okay, this is President Emmanuel Macron from still for the time being the president of France, and he says he said the development paradigm sought to impose a homogeneous path forward for the global population. Everyone was supposed to want to become the ideal middle-class North American European consumer. As we moved toward the goal, the mounting consequences and externalities became too powerful to ignore. the development paradigm became self-defeating. And this is a quote from Macron. He says, "What we are currently living through is a kind of major tipping point or a great upheaval. We're living at the end of what could have seemed an era of abundance." Obviously, that abundance was monopolized by very, very few people. It was in order for that abundance to exist, there had to be an enormous amount of poverty and exploitation around the world. But finally, these Western nations are waking up that it's not going to continue, right? The end of the abundance of products of technologies that seemed always available, the end of the abundance of land and materials, including water. So this is something coming from a leading president, the leading politician of one of the Western countries. And so I think one of the things that we see with this is that the countries who have financed most of the development projects around the world are finally starting to see that there needs that this era of abundance is coming to an end. And what does that mean for those of us who work in the development organizations, right? I don't think it necessarily means that, well, we're all having to be condemned to poverty, that or we can try and start the revolution and try to redistribute the global wealth that exists. That might be a strategy worth looking at. But here in Latin America, there is this alternative idea, the idea of post-development thought, the idea that hey, maybe having everybody chase after a dream that is impossible, the American dream, having everybody try to seek higher levels of affluence, and by doing that, ruining traditional livelihoods that offer the opportunity to live well in place, maybe we need to question that. As a definition, post-development theory argues that there is no universal model of development to be followed. There is no American dream that everybody needs to follow. There is no dream of affluence and progress that everyone needs to follow, right? And that current ideas around development have been constructed by experts in Western countries who have tried to impose their beliefs on the developing world. They are a form of Eurocentric discourse, a Western discourse. And I think that's extremely important. If we're gonna implement, if we're gonna work in the development world, the first thing is to follow the money, right? Who's sending the money to whom, right? And what are the implied values behind that? What are some of the assumptions that follows that money, right? And most of the times, I think what you're going to see is exactly that. Experts, a lot of times, people who 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 say, I mean, let's imagine a person coming from the United States or Canada or Europe who goes to an African country and all of a sudden assumes that he or she knows exactly what this community needs. Is there anything more violent, more this imposition of colonialist rhetoric that we know what you need, right? We don't know your history, we don't share your lifestyle, we don't live like you do, but we assume this ability to say that this is what you need to live well. Post-development thinkers say that is wrong. There's a fault to that. There's a fundamental flaw to that way of understanding what is development. Real quick, to look at two of the kind of leading post-development thinkers. Arturo Escobar is from Colombia. He teaches at different universities, but his main book, if you would like to read it, is called Encountering Development, the Making and Unmaking of the Third World. He published this back in, I think, in the 90s. So it was kind of in this global heyday when there were billions of dollars flowing into the aid industry, into the development industry. He was one of the first ones that said, "Hold on, what are the implications of this?" One of the things that he says is that this is a quote from his Encountering Development book. There was a type of development that was promoted which conformed to the ideas and expectations of the affluent West, to what the Western countries judged to be a normal course of evolution and progress. By conceptualizing progress in such terms, this development strategy became a powerful instrument for normalizing the world. Another term that a lot of post-development thinkers use is the idea of homogeneous, of using development, using aid to try and reduce diversity. Not only crop diversity, which is one thing, obviously, but the diversity of human expression, of cultural expression, the diversity of how different peoples in different areas around the world, from Inuit cultures in the cold, frigid Arctic North to the remaining remnants of hunter and gatherer societies in the Amazon, in certain parts of Africa, to indigenous cultures living in the jungles of Central America. This idea that everybody, no matter where they were, needed to kind of follow this same kind of homogenous path, right? And that the idea of what it meant to live well, the idea of what it meant to have a full and affluent life was kind of monopolized by one group of people, and they imposed this kind of homogeneity, this idea that everybody needs to conform to this. Uh, my favorite post-development thinker, Gustavo Esteva, he was an academic from Mexico City, who back in the 1970s decided he was done with academia, and he went and lived amongst the indigenous people in Oaxaca, Mexico. He started a kind of or unacademic, I'm not sure what the word he uses, but kind of a popular university called the Earth University, or University of the Earth, Universidad de la Tierra, where it was trying to help people reimagine what a local autonomous form of development could look like, right? Instead of just trying to replicate what the United States had done and all of the violence behind that, what Europe did and all the violence behind that, how can certain communities address the problems that they have? He wasn't trying to romanticize indigenous communities or farming communities or traditional ways of life, but trying to rescue what was good, what was functional in those expressions, in those cultural expressions of life ways, of cosmovisions, of how to adapt yourself to the place, and how to use, you know, that type of wisdom. And one of the things that he says, this is from a conference that he gave that I was able to participate in. He said, for 2/3 of the people on Earth to think of development, any kind of development, requires first the perception of themselves as underdeveloped, in a subordinate position, after comparing their own situation with an established standard. And that's an extremely strong kind of like psychological, uh, I would say, kind of force, right? For most people, those of who work in development organizations, you know, when a development organization comes into a community, there's this automatic this power dynamic imbalance, this hierarchy of those who know what the established standard is, and those who are below, who need to try and reach that established standard. So automatically you have these power imbalances, these hierarchies. You have the development industry or organization or development professional who says this is what you need to do. And no true development can start from that. You can't have, you know, communities automatically assuming that they're in this subordinate position of underdevelopedness. True development, from my perspective and the perspective of a lot of post-development thinkers, starts with people valuing what they have, what has worked, what their ancestors did, what their grandparents did, you know, understanding what their local geography can provide, what their community institutions can provide. And yes, and then from that wealth of what already exists, what has already functioned, start to look at what's missing, right? And how can we maybe interact with some of the technologies and ideas and influences from the outside, but not as a subordinate position, but as equals, right? Saying this is what we have to offer. This is what works for us. And we're going to take some of these ideas, maybe some of these technologies, some of these strategies from the outside world, and try to integrate them into our own communities. But that is completely different than what generally happens in most development projects, where there is, again, a power imbalance that says this is what we need, this is what we bring, this is where you are, and you need to come and try to achieve our standards, right? This established standard of what is development, what is progress, what is good, which certainly needs to be questioned. Gustavo Esteban, another one of his books that I would highly recommend to anybody who works on development, is The Future of Development, a Radical Manifesto. He was back in the 1970s, he was working in Mexico City. There was a huge earthquake, I think, in 1974. And there was lots of people that were left homeless, lots of houses that fell over after that earthquake. And what happened was there's this massive response around the world. The Mexican government and hundreds and thousands of different NGOs and nonprofit and aid agencies flooded into Mexico City, and trying to kind of redo this idea of how do we rebuild this city? How do we provide all of these urban poor people with new housing? And the experts came in to teach the urban poor that they needed the expertise of architects and professional planners in order to gain access to dignified housing. What happened was that lots of people were prohibited from rebuilding their own homes. Back in the 1970s, there were still a lot of people who had migrated to the suburbs of Mexico City who still knew how to, for example, build homes out of adobe bricks or build homes out of wood or build things with their own hands using their own traditional technologies. And that was outlawed all throughout Mexico City. What they wanted was everybody to follow this pattern of what the government defined, what the experts defined as dignified housing. And dignified housing was not an adobe house built by one's own hands, but a house that you finance through a bank that was built by an architect or a professional builder organization. And what happened was that led to an enormous amounts of debt. And there were several thousand people throughout Mexico City that simply did not have that access to funds, who were left homeless for several years. And Gustavo was there, and he said, "This is wrong. This trying to say that only experts have a solution to certain problems. Obviously, an earthquake that led to an enormous amount of homelessness was a problem. But this idea that the experts from the outside were the only ones that had the solution caused more problems than good." Um, he said that for these communities, this is a quote from his book, detaching themselves from, pardon, detaching themselves from the economic logic of the capitalist market or the socialist plan has become a matter of survival. They're trying to put the economic sphere on the margin of their lives. Interaction within these commons prevents scarcity in the economic sense of the term from appearing in them, which implies the redefinition of needs. So he's saying that he was seeing all around Mexico and all around Latin America these movements of communities who are starting to question this development paradigm and said that, look, if we are able to define what are our needs, right? We know what we need, we know how to respond to those needs. And the development organizations, whether it be government, non-government, coming in trying to say this is what you need, that's the problem. The problem is that we need to have more autonomy, more agency over determining what our needs are and how we're going to respond to those. I think a good place to start for us, for those of us who might find it difficult to start to question this progress narrative, this discourse of development, is question what is progress, right? And here are two different types of definitions. If you take up a dictionary, as a noun and as a verb. As a noun, progress is defined as a gradual betterment, a state that we come into. It's not necessarily something that we have to do. It's a gradual betterment. That's the dictionary definition. As a verb, however, progress is the process of developing a higher, better, or more advanced stage in action we work towards. And I think there's a pretty interesting kind of etymological difference, right? The idea of progress as a noun, this gradual betterment that perhaps communities can discover on their own, that they can determine what is better for them, given their history, given their culture, given their resources, given what they want to do as a community, versus progress as a verb, right? This idea that there is a path that everybody needs to follow. There is a way to higher, better, more advanced stage. And I would say that perhaps if we take these definitions, development organizations should seek to work alongside communities into this gradual betterment, right? Progress is a noun instead of progress as a verb. For those of us who work in development, I think we need to start with the recognition that this idea of advancement does not necessarily equate with betterment, right? You can advance things all the time. So, for example, the newest iteration of the iPhone, the one that comes out every couple months, we can say that that's an advancement in technological capabilities. The camera is better, it has more megapixels, it can do more things, we can record videos, it has more storage, whatever. So yeah, each new iteration of the iPhone might be more betterment, more advancement, sorry. But is it better? Is it certainly better for us? The idea of betterment is a value judgment, right? It requires to think about really what does it take if we're going to be if everybody in the world wants to replace their smartphone every year? Well, obviously that requires an enormous amount of mining of all of these rare earth metals. All of the phones that we throw away end up as e-waste pollution, leaching toxic heavy metals into our water sources, into our soils. People are becoming increasingly addicted to technology. There's this huge mental health crisis with young people who are addicted to their phones. So maybe the newest iteration of an iPhone is certainly an advancement in some senses, but is it a betterment? Well, the betterment isn't something that a development organization or a government or an aid agency can decide. Who decides what is better needs to be the community itself, right? Another thing that I think that we need to think about is kind of digging deeper into this idea of advancement versus betterment, right? I think that much, unfortunately, many development projects through the years have focused almost exclusively on this idea of advancement, right? Uh, More education, higher education, scholarships so that young people can go to school, more technology transfer so that small farmers can have better technology, transferring the whole thing of the green revolution so that small farmers who used to be subsistence farmers could start to spray their fields with pesticides and fungicides and use chemical fertilizers. This idea of advancement at all costs. I think that what we happen is we look back then and we see, well, maybe we've advanced, but maybe has that led to a betterment, right? If we take the small farmer used to maybe have less yields, maybe smaller yields from his field, um, but there was not this whole issue of the toxification of his farm, of young people being born with birth defects, because all of a sudden we have this enormous accumulation of chemicals in our food sources. Our water sources are being contaminated. That now a small farmer has to purchase seeds year after year after year because he's lost his traditional seeds, the native seeds that he used to grow. So in this case, maybe there was a temporary advancement, for example, in maybe yields of a certain crop, but the long term of that was a decrease in betterment, right? Less health for himself, less health for the local ecosystem, a loss in autonomy. Eventually, maybe he goes into debt and has to sell his farm and move the family into some slum in some horrible urban area. So in the short term, maybe we gain an advancement, but in the long term, we lose betterment. Daniel Schmachtenberger is another very interesting philosopher who's been kind of digging in recently to this whole idea of advancement versus betterment. And he says that progress worth believing is progress that is really about increasing betterment, not just advancing a certain metric at every and all cost, but taking a wider look at what is betterment for a community. What is really about in Spanish, we have this term called buen vivir, which can be translated as good life. What is the good life for people, right? And how can we help them? How can we accompany them, walk beside them in their discovery of what is betterment? Increasing the goodness in the world must still be able to be considered good once it has taken account all of the perspectives and externalities. One of the fundamental aspects of our globalized economy today is that nobody takes into account the externalities, right? We can say that, oh, it's great, this technology transfer, so that everybody can purchase the new iteration of the iPhone. It makes us more connected. People have more access to information. But what are the externalities of that, right? What about the child laborers in some Chinese mine where they're mining these rare earth metals? What about the communities that live below the local dump where all of these e-waste and heavy metals are leaching into the soil and poisoning children? If we're going to be serious about what is good, we need to be serious about following the externalities, right? What happens with that? And there are so many externalities to think about: climate change, topsoil loss, toxification of our biosphere. We need to think about what advancement of certain metrics means in the larger scale of things, right? And goodness, betterment, can only be truly good and better when we try to be honest and look at all of the consequences of a certain type of growth, a certain type of progress. Another thing, I have two more slides here, is this idea of wide versus narrow goals. I would argue that many of us who have worked in the development industry tend to have very narrow goals, right? When we are designing a project, we have one metric in mind, that we want to do this in this community. We want to help X community achieve a certain level of whatever it might be, a certain level of education, certain level of health, and we don't broaden our perspective to see how, if we are successful, if our development project is successful in achieving this narrow goal, we don't know what the effects are going to be on a wider scale. There's a great project I worked in Guatemala where there was this organization that was giving lots and lots of scholarships to young people to try and help them continue their education. Their narrow goal was to help young people in one specific rural community achieve higher levels of education, go off to university, and become university educated professionals. They achieved that narrow goal. But what happened was that on the wider scale of things, this essentially depopulated the rural community. There was a lot of, they were very successful in their narrow goal. But education from the Western perspective is generally about expropriating young people from rural communities and forcing them, in order to practice their profession, they have to move into urban areas. And so what happened was there was an enormous depopulation of this area that used to be a very healthy, prosperous kind of rural community. All the young people left, and all that were left were the old people. So can we say that was an effect, a negative effect perhaps, of a very narrow goal? What would have happened had the organization taken a broader perspective, a more wider perspective, maybe tried to instill a certain desire for young people to take their new knowledge from education and return to their community? But that was never thought about. The idea was that get education at all cost, and what happens, people eventually leave. This brain drain from rural areas to urban areas, and essentially depopulating the countryside, ruining traditional villages that were generally safe and healthy and good places to live. So narrow goals. Here's another example. We need to increase agricultural productivity at every and all cost, and chemical fertilizers can help us to do that. We did that. The goal was achieved. We used back in the starting in the 50s and 60s, we told small farmers around the world, start to use this chemical fertilizer. But we never thought about what might be the externalities of that. That all of the excess nitrogen, phosphorus from these chemical fertilizers led to these dead zones in oceans. They killed off aquatic life. The foods that we ate were certainly less and less nutritious because we're only giving them nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, not all of the micronutrients that plants need to give us healthy, nourishing food. People lost knowledge of how they had been farming their lands for generations and generations. And over 50 years, with the loss of that knowledge, topsoil is gone. So the narrow goal was achieved. We improved yields for a temporary moment, but the long-term goal was that there was no more topsoil left. If we were to change that to a wider goal, we could say we need to increase agricultural productivity in order to avoid famine, to help people have enough to eat. But we do not need to destroy soil. We do not need to destroy water sources. We do not need to, we're going to try and maintain traditional knowledge and practices. We need strategies to bind multipolar traps where the pursuit of individual interests leads to a detrimental outcome for society as a whole. Feeding the world cannot come at the price of compromising the ability of our children to feed their children. Wide goals, and this is something that I think comes from indigenous sources of knowledge, is that wide goals take into consideration future generations, right? It's not a success if we feed one generation, if by doing that we ruin the topsoil for future generations. And those of us who are parents, I have young children of my own. I think my own actions need to be guided by this wide goal of what's going to be good for their children, for their children's children, right? And lastly, two more things. Development should be a practice of encouraging wisdom, right? Wisdom involves not necessarily what not to do, what you should not do, right? Wisdom is about restraint, where you could have personal advantage, where you could have some near-term advantage, but it's actually not the right thing to do. So, for example, going back to our farmer analogy, the farmer might know that he might be able to make a little bit more money by throwing a bunch of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on his crops, that he might temporarily increase his yield and have some personal advantage, but that's not the right thing to do. It's poisoning water for people downstream. It's ruining his land for future generations. Wisdom, the idea of development, is trying to help people to think these things through, understand the process of betterment as something that's really good not just for you, but for all of the community and for future generations, right? How we can bind certain technologies and powers, not necessarily avoid them, but bind them, and so we can think long and hard about the consequences of our actions. We can expand our capacity for wisdom as much as we expanded for intelligence. And I think that's important. There is a difference between wisdom and intelligence. We could say it was very intelligent that scientists could come up with these chemical fertilizers that could drastically increase yields, but it wasn't wise. Wisdom is about how to continue to maintain good crop yields without destroying the soil, without putting all sorts of chemicals that are ruining health around the world. We can expand the scope of our considerations about what is a good goal as much as we can expand our goal achieving, right? And I think that's something that every development organization around the world needs to do, right? Everything's about defining a goal and trying to achieve it. Achieving it is not the most important thing. The most important thing is defining what is good, right? Once we know what's good, then we can work towards it. But we need to have more time to think about what is truly a good goal, what leads to betterment, not necessarily just achieving a certain thing, not necessarily just growing at every cost, but participating in this process of really what is thinking, right? Real quick, I'm running out of time here, I'm sorry, but a few practical strategies, I think, is we need to get rid of the middlemen, right? There's a quote that said about 2.1% of donor money goes directly to local organizations, either directly or indirectly. This is a funnel, right? So what happens, there's a lot of things saying we don't need all of these middlemen organizations that kind of channel the funds from donor to the communities. If communities have the perspective about what is good, what is better for them, well, let's give the money directly to them. Let's cut out all of these middlemen, which essentially just take away money from where it needs to go. Another thing is we need to value completely the economic contributions of subsistence, self-reliance, community autonomy, even when they contradict the Western idea of the Western tools of indicators and measurements, right? We need to look at communities that continue to practice these traditional ways of life and value that, right? There's a lot of wisdom in traditional lifestyles. In an effort to be faithful to thinking about wisdom and wide boundary goals, we need to allow the design, the direction, and the purpose of development projects to be defined directly by the people and communities where the project will take place. We don't need development professionals sitting behind a desk saying this is what this community needs. We need the community to be intimately involved in the process of defining what is better for them and how to achieve that, right? I think a lot of times that might say we need to move behind this whole idea of the Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the United Nations. And what we need is individual communities creating their own development goals, their own SDGs, right? Of what a good life entails for them. And understand that what a good life entails in one area might not necessarily be the same as in a different area. We need to allow for the differentiation, for the diversity of what a good life, of what betterment entails. And lastly, we need to turn development on its head. Going back to that first cartoon I showed, where it said you need to reform. I think what we need to show is that the true wisdom holders, these communities that continue to exist in a healthy sort of frugality, right? Where they might not have an enormous amount of abundance and affluence, but they live well within their place. A lot of times the places, these blue zones around the world where people live longest, where they live, there's this huge concentration of 100-year-old people, are not the most affluent areas in the world. They're places where people live simply, but live close to the land, protect their health, the health of the land. We need to let these wisdom holders, indigenous traditions, small farming communities, holders of true sustainability, we need to let them offer their advice. They should be the ones involved in designing projects, directing the de-development of the global north. So it's this idea of turning development on its head. We don't need the wealthy nations telling the poor nations what to do. I would say we need to turn that upside down. So we need to have the wisdom holders be in charge of teaching all of us how to live well in the places we live. I'm going to